You're on mute at the moment, Sarah.
There we go. Sorry. Hi, Amy. So when feeding does have to stop due to a cancer diagnosis, or in many cases not be commenced at all, what are the steps that can and should be taken to provide adequate follow-on support, both from professionals to the family, and equally, what do these families need to know they can access to help validate their experiences and loss of choice?
I think there are several steps around things that can help, and I wish I had an answer where I could say, well, you could ring this person and talk to them and it'll all go away and it'll all be fine. But I think one of the key things is actually giving yourself permission to grieve and recognize the loss in all of this. And I think that's particularly pertinent within a cancer diagnosis, because I bet you've probably got people around you who are telling you that other things are more important, as if this bit doesn't matter. And of course it still does. It's part of the bigger picture, and it can be affecting how you're coping and reacting to everything else. And I think just giving yourself that permission to say, breastfeeding was really important to me. It was an absolutely valid way that I wanted to feed my baby. And it's absolutely valid that I'm feeling this way when I can't. And I know that kind of sounds a little bit simple, but actually I think a lot of women really struggle with that, because we're sort of taught as mothers to kind of push our own feelings aside. And, you know, the main thing is your baby is healthy and your baby is here and it's all fine. But actually that's, again, it's a completely different thing. Your baby can be fine, but you can still really, really be grieving that loss of that connection and way of caring with them. So I think a very first step is to recognize that and allow yourself the time to grieve and think about healing around that. And a big part, and I mean, this will be different for everyone, but a big part, if you really are grieving that loss, is recognizing that it was important and it has been taken away from you, and giving yourself that time to process that, and not feeling like you have to say, well, it doesn't matter, my baby's being fed, my baby's growing, my baby's healthy, my baby's fine. And just giving yourself that time and talking to the people around you. And I really think this is one of the biggest tools we've got, to be able to openly say to people, this matters to me, this is how I feel, I need you to support that. And I think this would be my biggest message to anybody who is listening to this, who is caring for you know, a mother who can't breastfeed due to a cancer diagnosis, but also just more broadly, listen to her when she's telling you how she feels. This is important. You might not think it's important. You know, at the moment, I don't understand the football and why everybody's so excited for that, but I'm still nodding along when people are, you know, telling me about how the games are going. Listen to her, listen to what she's telling you and her individual story and why it mattered to her. And although some people might be reassured with messages such as, well, you know, fed is best, the main thing is your baby is fed, actually that can feel really, really dismissive to someone who's just told you that it really, really matters to them. So I think the core message is just talking and listening in all of this. And I said earlier about, you know, talking to infant feeding specialists, talking to lactation consultants. Quite a lot of lactation consultants and breastfeeding specialists now are starting to do sessions where they're specifically looking at breastfeeding grief and trauma and helping women process through that. And again, talking to some of the main organisations around this. You can contact the Association of Breastfeeding Mothers, La Leche League, the NCT. They'll help you through this, because they understand and they're some of the best people to help there. And if people are dismissing it, it's reaching out to those people who understand and will care for you and listen to you in that way.
I was on mute myself now. One of the things that when I'm sort of delivering sessions on this subject is about, goes into the presumption that as health professionals, because somebody either says no when they're offered a service the first time, we don't necessarily revisit the offer at a more appropriate juncture, or if we're having a second or third visit with them, we don't revisit the offer of that support if it's flatly turned down. Whether that's, well, I think it's sometimes perhaps more in the case of offering partner support than the the person who's birthed. But in this kind of scenario, it's often about, why don't we automatically ask a mum who is not able to breastfeed whether she'd like to see the breastfeeding support worker? And there's almost this default response that, well, because she's not going to be feeding, there aren't going to be any issues she's going to experience. She's not going to need help in terms of getting a better latch or what might, increase supply, and therefore we don't offer them that support. And the reality from many women, and I remember one specific, common feedback from a family of ours, said she would have liked somebody to have come round to the house after the midwife, after 20 days, and just said, look, I'm struggling with the fact that I can't do what I had dreamt of doing, or, what I'd aspired to do as a new mum. And it's that trying to get out of the habit of presuming what somebody will and will not want to access and support. Whether we think it's appropriate or not, as the person who's supporting them, is kind of irrelevant. It's whether they want to access it or not. And is there a kind of do you think there's a culture shift that's still needing to happen there, to say, do you know what, offer everything and let them choose what they don't want, as opposed to us thinking, well, my view on this situation is X, therefore you will want this. And it actually potentially removes quite a lot of support networks for people.
I think there's a kind of mistaken belief sometimes that if we start talking about breastfeeding to a woman who couldn't, that we're going to upset her in some way, as if by not talking about it, she'll never think about it again. But of course, it's part of that dismissal, isn't it? That part of the suggestion that it doesn't matter. And I think just raising the option for her, it's not going to upset her anymore, but it does give her that option to be able to talk about it. And I think, a very simple question is, how are you feeling about feeding your baby? Is there any support you would want for that? And that can mean support with not being able to breastfeed, because when I was doing the research around breastfeeding grief, women very clearly said that there were two elements to their grief. There was the element of not being able to breastfeed and everything they lost with that. And then there was the impact of how they were treated. So one of the issues that we really have in the UK is that we haven't got very good support when you can't breastfeed. So there is some support when you're struggling with breastfeeding, but that still needs to be better. But actually, when you stopped, it's almost like someone goes, right, okay, then just get on with it then. There's no kind of standard opportunity to think about, well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about how you're feeling. Let's give you the support and the connection you need to give your baby formula and feed them responsively and still have that skin to skin and that connection with them, and maintain as much as we can of the broader aspects of breastfeeding. But again, it's about opening up the conversation and not being scared to do that. And within this, there are so many different experiences and so many different responses to being able to breastfeed, but we have to ask the question in the first place about how people are feeling. And as you say, sometimes, right after that diagnosis and that realizing you aren't able to breastfeed might not be the right time. They may need time to process it. They may need time to work on other things first. And, having talked to those women in their 70s and 80s, they would still benefit, I think, now from having someone to talk through it with them. It's never too late. And if it may be that later on you're ready to process it. So a good example of that is that we know that during COVID, rates of postnatal depression really increased amongst a lot of women because of the lack of face-to-face services and connection and missing out on it, everything that they had hoped for and planned for their baby. But during the pandemic, there was a lot of keeping going and kind of not thinking about how you're feeling and just thinking about, well, how are we going to get through this next stage? And it's now a lot of women are writing to me saying, I had a baby 2 years ago, and suddenly I feel, really overwhelmed and anxious and depressed. And it's because they've had enough time and distance away from it that suddenly they're starting to process it all. So I think, again, it's following up with women and letting them know that option is available. If you had your baby 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 years ago and you're still struggling, you can still go and talk to someone about it and process it, because it's important for you, but it will also help those of you around you as well, in terms of how you react to them when they have babies and feed them. We're all part of a broader network together, so it's so important.